Well, hello, and welcome back. I'm AJ O'Neill, and I'll be your instructor for tonight's Beyond Code Live. Tonight's session is on more programmer jargon because I am still working on some of the HTML material for later this week, and I want to make sure it's good and ready before I present it to you. Now, if at any point during this session tonight you have an aha moment, go ahead and give this a thumbs up and comment with the time code in the comments below. And also, any questions or any clarifications that you want, feel free to do that. And let's see. Oh, yeah. Normally, I would say open up your gist.github.com to take notes. Tonight, player's choice. Because I don't know how much it's not much technical we're going over as it is ideological. But you might want to do that anyway. And with that, let's just go ahead and get started. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about styles of programming tonight. So the first I'm going to start with is pair programming. You've probably heard about this, might not know what it is, and that's because there's no real formal definition to it, or rather there is a formal definition, but the way that people actually do it varies. Really what this just means is it's the buddy system. Often another term for this would be rubber ducking. So rubber ducking is when you just need to have another person present, a fresh set of eyes, to be able to work on a problem, and in talking about it out loud, you end up with a good solution. So pair programming is typically the simplest and one of the most effective types of pair programming is rubber ducking. The other type of pair programming that is a little more formal is, I forget the exact name, but there's the driver and there is the other person that's not the driver. And I don't even remember which is which, but essentially you have one person who is talking out loud and giving instruction and working through the problem, and you have the other person who is at the keyboard and typing out characters. And this type of pair programming can be effective in mentorship and just when you need, again, two eyes. The most important part about pair programming is that it's for when you need two eyes on a problem, so that if you're trying to overcome some mental fatigue, or you've just been staring at something too long, or you just, two heads are smarter than one. And pair programming as a general rule can result in faster, better, more reliable code than programming alone. One of the common myths is that if you have two programmers working on a task, then you're wasting half of your resources. In fact, when you have two people on a task, they're each going to see things and catch things differently. So you can actually have really good turnaround. It's not necessarily going to work that way every single time. There are times when one person is asleep at the wheel, so to say, but pair programming, when there's a good rhythm between two people, it can go really well. And you can do this over Zoom. You can do it desk by desk. Lots of different ways that you can do it. You can even do it while one person is driving and the other person is describing the problem, especially with the rubber ducking style. So moving on, mob programming is the next thing we have in the list here. Mob programming is like pair programming to the extreme. Mob programming is when you get several developers in a room, typically people that you have team members that are coming from all aspects of the problem. So you may have somebody who typically works with the database. You may have somebody who typically works on the front end. You may have somebody who typically works the Linux or DevOps side of things, someone who's more specialized in the APIs. So you'll have different people in your team or in your office that are probably usually working on different things. But sometimes you need to be able to get to a functional demo of a new style of product, and it really does work best to have the different types of thinkers in the room together and kind of trading back and forth on the keyboard. Have one screen that's the big screen that most people are looking at, and kind of trading off with, okay, well, I need it to do this. Okay, well, now let's get it to do that. And similar to what I described with pair programming, just with more people. And there are some companies that only mob program. It's extremely rare, and I don't know. Personally, I have a hard time believing that that could be effective all of the time, whereas I don't have a hard time believing that pair programming could be effective all the time. But I do know of people who do this exclusively. And it is a strategy. It can work. It is good. I have definitely experienced the benefit of mob programming sessions when we have 4 or 5 people that have different specialties that are all looking at the problem and shouting out at the same time. Oh, no, 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 we need to do it this way. We need to do it that way. And what mob programming is really great, that the really, really, really great thing about mob programming is that it helps us stay away from this one right here. Design by committee. Design by committee is the worst possible way to program, and it is the inverse of mob programming. So mob programming is everybody's actively involved in thinking on the problem at the same time. Design by committee is when everybody's in the same room but no one's at the keyboard and they're talking about potential problems with an approach, and it tends to be more of, instead of, well, let's see how we can make this work, it tends to devolve into the reasons that this can't work, or the reasons that we have to have more meetings about it, or that we need to think it through more, and then nothing gets done. So design by committee is when you take the keyboard away and you get the managers involved and work isn't actually getting done. It's just talking about work and trying to spec out work and estimate work. This is no good. You want to, when you recognize those situations, you will be a blessing to the company that you are working with if you can transform that into a mob programming situation by suggesting, hey, what if we just work on this at the keyboard together? Even if the only thing you can get to is pseudocode in a draft document, that is progress and a step in the right direction and can lead to real code and real results. The next thing in the list I have here is Skunk Works. And Skunk Works, to talk about Skunk Works, first we need to talk about the Grace Hopper clock. So let me see if I can bring up here the Grace Hopper clock. Bum, ba-da-dum, bum. Yes, here we are. Okay. This is something I like to keep by my desk, except that I left it at my last place of employment. And I don't have it anymore, but someone does. So, Grace Hopper was one of the first programmers, period. And she was, if you've ever heard the phrase, it is easier to ask forgiveness than permission, she is the one you have to thank for that phrase. Because she worked in the military, but she did not operate in the way that we typically think of government operating. And she had a clock by her desk that ran counterclockwise. And it was a reminder that we need to think outside the box, to do things differently, and to attack problems head on. And so I might go and put an Amazon link to a Grace Hopper clock that you can buy. Typically speaking, these are cheap novelty clocks and they don't keep time really well, and you have to reset them once a week or so. But I think that symbolically it's a great thing to have, and it's a good talking point for team discussion and team values and company values and personal values. I also like to have things like the Zen of Python and the Go Proverbs printed out and hanging around. But that's another discussion for another time. In fact, I'll go ahead and just put that on here because we need to talk about that too. Zen of Python and Go Proverbs. Those are important to talk about later. Okay, so the tangent that we're on, talking about Grace Hopper, is because Skunk Works, because we're going to talk about Skunk Works. She was somebody who would formulate a plan and get it done and present results, not just something to bicker about. And this is how she was able to say it is easier to ask forgiveness than permission, because she did things, she came up with good results, and then she presented the results. Skunk Works is actually, it comes out of, I think, Lockheed Martin in reference to the SR-71, I believe. There's a really good talk about this. I'll try to find a link to as well. Skunkworks is basically this idea. It's the idea that you do something under the radar, as it were. You do something out of band. You and a couple of other teammates get together, identify a problem, and you work on solving it without getting it involved and bogged down with the managerial process, without putting it in a backlog or creating a user story or putting in a priority thing. You just take some, an hour or two around lunch or maybe the Friday afternoon, and you just work on it together. And then once you've got something that actually works, at that point, you kind of field it out a little bit with some of the other team members and let them kind of see and get a sniff of it. And then you kind of move it back towards the managerial process once you've already got something that has demonstrated its value and is really rock solid. So that's the idea of Skunkworks. And if it doesn't work out, then you just toss it and, sweep it under the rug and whatever. You don't worry about it. But it's the idea that you go quickly to get something to a functional, valuable state. And I think the reason it's called Skunkworks is because the building where they were designing the SR-71, or if it wasn't that, it was another plane right before it. It was one of those top secret planes, and they were trying to figure out stuff that typically couldn't be done with materials that weren't readily available at the time. I think it's because there was a building that smelled like skunk. It was out in the field or something. I could be completely wrong on that, but I think that's where the terminology comes from. But it's just projects that are, kind of the ideal is the projects that are successful that got underway without being bogged down in the managerial process first. And then extreme programming I listed here to talk tonight, not because we actually are going to talk about it, but just because it sounds like it might fit in with these other things with the pair programming and mob programming. And, well, what's the extreme programming? Extreme programming is actually a methodology like Agile or Waterfall. So it is not a style of programming that you do by yourself with other people in the sense of hands on the keyboard, but rather a methodology of how you approach the different processes of programming. And so I'll talk more about that another night, but I thought that might be a good thing for us to go over while I continue to work on some of this other material. If you found this to be useful, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I'd love to know what you found useful in the comments. Other things that you'd like to know, questions that you have, put those down there. And of course, if you're interested in continuing to watch the live streams, subscribe. The link is in the description to the live channel, as well as if you are interested in the edited versions that are reorganized in order, there is the Beyond Code Bootcamp playlist in the description as well, and you may find the edited version of this video even there, depending on whether or not I've actually got caught up. I'm quite far behind at the moment. And I think that is what we have for the night. So yeah, like, subscribe, and ring the personalized bell. And we will be discussing some HTML stuff later this week. I've got two topics in mind that I mentioned before. One is kind of going over the landscape of HTML elements in a way that I didn't before when we did the What HTML Is Not episode, which, by the way, I highly recommend you search that out and check it out in the channel. But when we did that, we kind of just talked about the syntax of HTML and did a very brief exercise, but I wanted to go into a little bit more material with the common elements that you're likely to use on a daily basis and kind of distinguishing those from the other 100, because I won't go into it now because we'll go into it tomorrow. I don't want to muddy this up. And then the other bit is the resume template. So the resume template is almost ready, and so I will be asking you to create your resume from this template so that you can get your resume as part of your portfolio itself started and going. So those are things that are coming up. And with that, you have a wonderful evening, morning, whatever it is, wherever time you are. Adios.